All right. We'll get started here. Feel free to take your time getting settled in. Again, I feel silly using the mic with 10 people in here, but it's for the stream, so they can hear me. Yeah, we got Paul and Andrea are getting back tomorrow. Mike and Brenda are coming back this afternoon. Vacation season. But when you're retired, you don't take vacations, they tell me. You just take trips.
Life is a vacation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Already?
Hey, it's never too early.
My
No, I got it.
daughter quit her job.
Yeah.
But she's not old enough to retire. She said, I'm taking a sabbatical.
An extended sabbatical.
After 4 months, she went back to another job.
Hey, that's perfect.
Yeah, worked out.
I'm a big proponent of sabbaticals, which comes from the word Sabbath, which means rest.
I was a big proponent of sabbaticals until it didn't stay a sabbatical.
It just became unemployment. Yeah. Yeah. That's what's the word I'm looking for? Well, they're involuntary sabbatical. That's the word I was looking for.
There you go.
Okay, just a little bit on my plan. I'm thinking, and this might be optimistic. I'm thinking that I'm going to be able to finish this up before Advent, right? Because I got 1, 2, 3 Sundays before Advent, and I think I can do it. Because, well, as you'll see today, we're going to kind of, the 3rd century goes pretty quickly. It's kind of more of the same in a lot of ways. And where I committed to stopping is once we get essentially to when Constantine takes over. I've changed my mind a little bit on that. We're going to go all the way up through the end of the 4th century because Constantine doesn't actually mark kind of the great victory of the church, so to speak. There are actually several ecumenical councils that happen during the 4th century that really kind of mark the formalization of the institutional church in a lot of ways, right? Where post-Constantine Christianity becomes, it takes a long time before it becomes the state religion. It doesn't actually even occur during the beginning of Constantine's reign as emperor.
So heresy is just like not a big deal. It's just getting things straightened out. And then heresy becomes like a big deal.
Yeah.
Are we going to hit that at all, or is that after 4th century?
That's after 4th century.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's the latter end of the 1st millennium is when it becomes a big deal. So what I'm telling you is, and this is a good segue actually, is that by November 26th, we will be wrapping up early Christian history. By the end of November, we'll be wrapping up early Christian history. Then we have 3 Sundays and then Christmas, because Christmas Eve is on a Sunday this year. Yeah. So I'm tossing a question out to you now. What 3-week thing do you want to talk about? And mull on it. We've got a couple of weeks to think about it. I was tossing around the idea of doing kind of a crash course in the history of the formation of Israel. I'm not sure that I want to do that. that requires theoretically, but the question is more: do I have enough time to prep that and prep it in a way that I can do the whole thing justice? And I think the answer is no. I've got Christmas coming up and other stuff. So if there is a book of the Bible or even just a topic that you want, that you're interested in, let me know. The other question to think about is what we do in the beginning of the year. So we'll take a couple of weeks off, and Christmas, obviously, Christmas Eve, there won't be anything. Likely the first, we kind of usually end up taking a lot of January off because we usually don't do anything the first week in January. But then the last week in January is a semi-annual meeting, right?
Right.
So, I probably will still do adult ed in some form sometime in January, but I don't know if I'll start the next big thing at that point, because I hate having it broken up. We'll see. But that is to say, what do you want to study in the spring? Is there anything that you've been mulling over that you want to talk about? One of the options is we could totally at some point do history from essentially 4th century to Reformation, right? That's an option. We did Reformation history back in 2017. We could go back and revisit that as well too, or we could get out of history in general, right? I like history, but I like a lot of other things too. The other thing that I'm tossing around is that we did like the Levitical and Deuteronomical laws a long time ago. It might be fun to go back and take a peek at those again. I am, by the way, I think I mentioned this last week, I am teaching a class in January through March, essentially. It's an 8-week course through the Synod. So it's a Zoom course, and I'm co-teaching it. I'm not doing the whole thing. And I still don't know how many weeks I'm teaching yet, because one of the teachers can't decide whether or not they're actually going to teach, which is driving me nuts. There's 2 of us for sure. The 3rd person is making up their mind. The title of the course, I can't remember. It's a long title, but it's basically the general idea is wrestling with God. So the 2 kind of topics we're going to cover in this. So it's going to be myself and Deacon India, and I can't remember India's last name. She serves. Oh, what's the name of the congregation? My brain is just doing things this morning. Anyways. There's 2 main topics in the course. Deacon India is going to talk about names of God. She's going to talk about names of God, which is going to be great, okay? You have all the JDEP stuff, right? So, Yahweh, Adonai, Elohim, being those names that you trace throughout Genesis as a way of figuring out which tradition wrote that part of Genesis, right? But then you have a bunch of really interesting imagery for God, like feminine imagery, the concept of Sophia and the Greek concept of just wisdom in general. So she's going to do names of God. I'm going to work with the tough text. So the lens that we'll kind of read everything through is the story of Jacob wrestling with God at Peniel. It's kind of like a framework for what it means to wrestle with Scripture. And we're going to look at Judges 19, the most awful chapter in the entire scriptural witness. We're going to look at some pieces of Genesis, probably like Judah and Tamar, which is another awful text. I'm still kind of working out my part of that curriculum. But this is just a plug that if you want to do it, we kind of signed up as a church already.
So. We haven't actually done that. Let me give you
Yeah.
a quick administrative announcement. So you'll see in the weekly highlights that come out by email, there's a link to this program.
Yep.
And if you click onto the link, you'll find that there are 2 ways to sign up. One is as an individual or a family, and they ask you for an individual donation. But we can also sign up as a congregation.
Yeah.
And we have a donation, designated donation to do that. But we haven't heard of anybody that wants to sign up that way. So we haven't.
Susan raised her hand.
Yeah, I went through part of the process.
Okay.
I don't think I'm successfully registered.
Okay.
So, and just to put it out there, what you can do is you can register without giving a donation.
Right.
And then what we would do is the congregation would send in a donation to the synod.
Do we have to be all in one room in a single Zoom
Nope.
instance?
Nope, absolutely
If
not.
we do it as a
Nope.
congregation?
No, as soon as you register, you'll get, your name, your email will be registered, and then they'll email you the Zoom link when it comes time. No, you absolutely do not have to be in the same room together.
How many people would be useful to do it? Okay, I tell you what, I'll just go ahead.
Okay.
There tomorrow. I'll sign up the congregation.
Okay.
And then you can decide if you want to contribute as an individual on top of that. But you don't have to, because once we're signed up as a Milwaukie church, you can just put your name into the hat and they'll approve it.
Great.
Is it costing the congregation anything to sign up?
Pardon?
Is it costing the congregation anything to sign up?
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, we have a donation to do that, a designated donation.
What's the dates of that again?
it's Thursdays, and it starts the first Thursday in January, and then runs for 8 weeks. So I don't know, 7 p.m. I think.
22nd, January 4th to February 22nd,
What time is it?
6:30.
6:30. I should know this.
What are those dates again?
I know what my content is.
What are those dates again?
Yeah. Susan, what were those dates?
January 4th to February 22nd,
January 4th to February 22nd.
6:30 p.m.
Yeah, 6:30 p.m. I think I only have an hour. This will be like my third course that I've taught for the Synod. It's great because like the last one I taught, we had people from Burns and people from Portland and people from Klamath Falls.
Arizona.
And we will have people from Arizona as well too. Yeah. It's really fun. It's a big diversity of people, which makes it, because we have great conversations, but it's fun to have other people from different, areas. Okay. Think about what you want to study next besides that. But that was kind of my way of saying, I'm going to be teaching that topic. So another option that we could do is we could also mirror or add on to those conversations that we're having in that class in here as like a side study as well too, which might be fun.
I was gonna say, why don't you practice on us in December?
We could. In fact, well, okay, that gave me an idea. We'll do Judges 19 twice. No.
Story about St. Thomas and his trips back to the east to India.
Yeah.
And I just don't know much about that, so that would be on my list.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can unpack that story.
Whenever.
Okay.
I'll be around.
All right. Okay, let's talk 3rd century. 3rd century is very similar to the 2nd century as far as the Christian experience goes. What sets it apart, though, is the development of theology. So we talked about how the rise of Gnosticism in the 2nd century kind of spurred a shift in thinking and teaching amongst in Christianity in general. The past couple weeks we talked just kind of categorizing what was the Christian population like, and in general, it was mainly middle and lower class people living in cities, right? So the term pagan that we're well familiar with, oh yeah, the choir is singing this morning too, thanks Susan. The term pagan that we use in a modern sense to describe people who are not of our religion actually comes from describing rural people. So those who were living outside of the cities, out doing the farming and whatnot, were often described as pagans. And it's a derogatory term. I mean, hillbillies is essentially what they call. So what happens is, because Christianity was primarily centered in urban areas, as Christianity begins to spread, the word pagan is used to describe those who aren't Christian yet, because it's primarily rural people. Interesting thing. But again, one of the markers of Christianity at that point was there were very few people that were wealthy or in power, right? There were exceptions to this, but by and large, Christians were on the underside of the economic coin, okay? This affects things.
Yeah. Primarily urban people? Or
Yes.
Rural?
Urban specifically because that's how Christianity spread. Which is something that we're going to talk about, because the 3rd century is fertile ground for the spread of Christianity. Okay, this is when the population curve really goes up. Okay, but yes, primarily urban people. Keep in mind that the distinction between urban and rural that we work with is not the same as urban and rural in the empire. I don't know. It would be hard for me to even categorize what that means. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, Matt, that's kind of what's going on. So the other thing that this affects is that many of the people who are participating in Christianity are generally also not super well educated, right? So literacy rates are probably not super high amongst Christians at this point. And as a result, you don't have a lot of big thinkers, so to speak, right? You don't have people that are, spending all their times in Roman schools, studying for their PhD or whatever the second and third century equivalent is, What changes in the third century, and again, as a response to Gnosticism, so needing to kind of like refine their theology, is that you get the rise of people who start writing and speaking extensively about Christian theology, capital T. And you might recognize some of these names, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time digging into these folks. If you're interested, with Google, yeah, Wikipedia has some great articles on each of these folks. Probably the person that most folks would recognize, because I know Jill knows that name, is Origen of Alexandria. He is a prolific writer during middle of the 3rd century. These other folks are all people who contributed consistently to the conversation.
And their works, it used to be on Amazon. Books were $1.99. So you could pick up any of their books
The
for like
works
nothing.
of Origen, the works of Tertullian. Yeah, I can't remember what publishing house put those together, but yeah, you can get the Kindle version pretty cheap. And it's dense. It's
Yes.
dense reading. I'm not gonna lie. It's not light bedtime reading.
Yeah, that wasn't recommendation.
Yeah, it was just an FYI. Those do exist. And what's really fascinating too is that the writings of these folks really, in a lot of ways, are the beginnings of ideas that we take for granted today. Right? This is again, I keep trying to impress upon you is that it's not like Jesus dies, the apostles take over, and they've got all of Christian theology figured out on Tuesday. Okay? What we take for granted as orthodoxy today is the process of 2 millennia of theological thought and writing that begins with these folks. Okay, which is why later Christian writers like Augustine and folks like that, they're reading these folks. That they're using these folks for conversation. Again, I'm not going to go through each of these. Irenaeus is early 2nd century. Origen is 3rd century. Sorry. So like I think he's around like 220, 215, 220, something like this. Origen is closer to the middle, 240s, 250s. Clement is less. He writes less, but he is responsible for training Origen. Origen is one of Clement's students, but he's a writer. Tertullian of Carthage is interesting because he ends up joining one of the remarkable heresies of the 3rd century, which I'm sad that Mike Hegel isn't here because I would make fun of his home state. So there was a heresy that comes out of early third century. So like I think Montanus is the guy's name. So they're called the Montanists, just like Montana. So I was going to ask Mike if that's where his state got its name from. So a guy named Montanus, who was not raised in a Christian household, he was raised by pagans, picks up the mantle of preaching. We don't know a lot about where he comes from or how he's trained or how he encounters Christianity.
And what year?
Shoot. It's early 3rd century. So like I think he was born in he's born in the late 2nd century. So like 190 or something like that. But then he's born earlier. He's born mid 2nd century. He's like 135. But the movement catches fire late second, early 3rd century, right? Because Tertullian of Carthage, who operates during the 3rd century, he's a Montanist. And the interesting thing about the Montanists, so it's from this guy named Montanus, he starts it, and the movement is called the Montanists. Yeah, I can't help myself. It's funny. is essentially the 3rd century equivalent of modern day Pentecostalists. That's the best way that I can characterize it. It's really fascinating. And the characteristics of what Montanus preached are essentially, emphasis on the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit communicates to everybody. And so everybody is responsible for listening to the Holy Spirit speaking to them, the Paraclete. As such, one of the major facets of Montanism was an emphasis on prophecy, right? So there were 2 women that went around with Montanus, and their names were Priscilla and Maximilla. It's a great dynamic duo there. And they did everything from claiming to do miracle healings to just spontaneous prophecy. The Holy Spirit would speak to them. So you can imagine what this might look like. It looks very similar to modern ecstatic worship, right? Where they would gather in a marketplace or whatever. Where? Oh, Montanus takes over a small town called, starts with a P. Anatolia, Turkey. Sorry, Turkey. They use all the old. In that day and age, it was the Anatolian, region of Phrygia. If you're familiar with Phrygia, no. So Turkey. He takes over a town. Wait, he doesn't take over it. He sets up shop in a town called Papuza. I'll write that down. Papuza. And here's the remarkable thing is that this is actually a pretty successful movement. So successful, in fact, that one of the 4 main teachers of the 3rd century himself later becomes a Montanist, right? But it's a movement that is later rejected by Orthodoxy. Okay, so again, we're not gonna get too heavy into talking about the idiosyncrasies of Montanism, but can you kind of picture what that might look like, right? Which is really fascinating to think about it in a 3rd century Roman perspective. But ecstatic preaching, spontaneous, Holy Spirit inspired prophecy, that kind of stuff. A couple of the unique aspects of Montanism were that they allowed women to be leaders, which is pretty great, right? And in fact, we'll talk about this too. That's one of the unfortunate things that happened over the course of the 3rd century, is that at the end of the 2nd century, there actually were quite a few women leaders in the Christian church. But, as with all things, as a reaction to some of the more Gnostic and what later heretical movements, women in leadership gets phased out over the course of the 3rd century. So, and I would just put this out there for those traditions that continue to refuse to ordain women in their leadership and point to the early Christian church's justification for it. They're sadly misinformed. Women were preachers. Women were leaders in the church up through 1st and 2nd century, and then because of reactions to groups like the Montanists, it ends up getting phased out. The other reason that women as leaders gets phased out is because, typical guys, is the men get anxious about wanting to centralize leadership, right? And essentially kind of perform a takeover in a lot of ways. We'll talk about that later. So they allow and encourage women in leadership. Maximilla and Priscilla as 2 examples of that. The other thing is that they encourage that their preachers or pastors have salaries, right? So they had a professional clergy over and against many of the church leaders at that time who were essentially following Paul's model, which is that the call to priest, pastor, church leader, bishop, deacon, presbyter, whatever you want to call it, was a tent maker, role where they had a day job, and then on the side they did this Christianity stuff, right? But Montanus, he paid his pastors. Really fascinating. So Tertullian, good Lord, Tertullian was a teacher that eventually was swayed by Montanism, which then is rejected in kind of this, not quite organized manner that we talked about when we were talking about Gnosticism. It's rejected over the course of the 3rd century. Again, if you want to learn more about Montanism, there's a great Wikipedia article on it as well too. It's fairly interesting. Let's talk about persecutions. And again, I'm kind of going through this stuff a little bit fast. If you want to chat about any of this stuff, we can totally stop. Because the content that I want to get to before the end of the class today is talking about what Christian worship and life looks like in the 3rd century. Because one of, again, we're watching theology evolve during this time, but we're also watching the Christian church evolve. We're watching their practices not change, but kind of solidify, right? They become similar. I don't have the word I'm looking for right now, but so let's talk about persecutions. There's 2 major ones that happen over the course of the 3rd century. First one is under one of my favorite emperors, just because of his name, Septimus Severus. Which, if that sounds familiar, it's because one of the main sort of antagonists in the Harry Potter series is Severus Snape. So Septimus Severus. I hope he didn't have a speech impediment. He is emperor from something like 220 onwards. Again, I should have probably written these dates down. And his big thing is syncretism. We've talked about syncretism. Syncretism is kind of one of the core tenets of the Roman Empire, which is that we've got gods that we worship, and then when we encounter new gods, we just bring your god into our set of gods, right? But what is important for Severus is that he, similar to a lot of the other guys we're going to encounter in the 3rd and 4th centuries, he is looking at the complications that the empire is facing, and particularly military issues. And he is convinced that the reason that the empire is struggling is that we've tolerated too much wiggle room. In other words, wiggle room. We've tolerated too much looseness with the rules, particularly around religion, right? So we'll see this emphasized later with Decius, who we'll talk about in just a moment. But Severus insists that now all citizens, all people living in the Roman Empire, you can worship whatever god you want, but you have to bow to Sol Invictus, which is the divine son, basically, the ruling emperor. Okay. So, and again, what's fascinating about this is the Roman imperial imagery and how you actually watch over time, the deification of the emperor almost. Okay. And again, it's not necessarily about him. It's not about him being a god, but it's the idea that everybody does the same thing, which is, again, you can worship whatever god you want, but you have to essentially worship ours as well too, or at least don't say bad things about them. Okay. Who does this rub the wrong way? The Jews and the Christians. Shocker, right? It's the same thing that we watched happen in the 1st and 2nd centuries, which is Christians are fairly obstinate, in this issue, which is that Christ alone, right? It's a monotheism. To bow to the emperor in worship is essentially to forsake Christ. It's the way that they understand it. And keep in mind that this obstinacy is the wrong word, but this why is my brain not working? I didn't drink enough coffee. This insistence on following Christ alone comes out of, in a lot of ways, the persecution that they faced. 2 names which become become well known as a result of Septimus Severus's persecutions are Perpetua and Felicitas. Have you ever heard those names before? Perpetua or Perpetua and Felicitas. These are 2 women who are arrested. And what Septimus Severus decrees is not necessarily a persecution of existing Christians, but rather a persecution of those who are converting, right? Because again, the idea is that everybody should be following the Roman Empire. And he thinks that those who, because again, we talked about what converting to Christianity looked like. You would spend 1 up to 3 years as a novitiate, right, as a novice, or a catechumenate was the word that they used, learning about Christianity until you became a candidate for baptism. You were then baptized a whole bunch of people, which we'll talk about in a bit, on Easter Vigil. So there was a sense of secrecy around Christianity as well, too, which Severus saw as a threat. And so he says, essentially, that if you're converting to Christianity, you're going to get arrested. And if you don't recant, we'll kill you. Well, Perpetua and Felicitas are 2 women that are part of a group of 5 catechumenates who get arrested. What's unique about them is that I think it's Felicitas is pregnant at the time. Okay, so they get arrested. The authorities are trying to get them to recant. They refuse, and at some point they're really, putting the screws to Felicitas, especially saying, think of your unborn child. Okay, well, they spend so long in captivity that she eventually gives birth to the child. And so the Roman soldiers are making fun of her because, this is natural childbirth. There's no, wonderful little drugs to help with the pain. And so they make fun of her because of her moaning during childbirth. And so they say to her, if you think that's painful, what do you think it's going to be like in the arena, right? And Felicitas' response to it, I should probably look which one of them it is. But anyways, her response to it is, now, okay, how does it go? Now I only have one person to worry about, is essentially what she says. And that, in other words, I was moaning for my child, but for myself, now, God is, I'm with God or something. I'll look it up here in a second. But it's really fascinating. So what happens is there's actually a story that's written about Perpetua and Felicitas, which is called the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas, which is widely distributed amongst Christian communities. And what's been happening over the last century, so from the 2nd century up into the 3rd century, is that kind of the stars of Christianity, and one of the major drivers behind people converting to Christianity are the martyrs, right? Those who are killed in any one of these various persecutions that sporadically happen over the course of time. Stories are written about them, stories are shared of them. In fact, in Christian communities on Sunday worship, they will often read from the stories of the martyrs as examples of faithfulness, right? So it's really fascinating, how, this guy is trying to essentially stamp out Christianity because it's a threat to the empire. But in his trying to stamp it out, he creates some of their best propaganda. It's kind of a cool thing. And the same thing, I hate to keep giving Wikipedia business, but there's some good articles there. Or if you picked up the book and you're following along, Justo Gonzalez speaks quite a bit about it. Then let's talk about Decius. Decius, interesting guy. Okay, hold on, I found the relevant passage. Yeah, I was right. Perpetua. Felicitas is the one with the kid. Perpetua also had a great quote. So she gets arrested, and I think it was her parents or somebody tried to persuade her to abandon her faith. And she answered, just as everything has a name and it's useless to try to give it a different name, she had the name of Christian, and this could not be changed. It's very interesting. Oh, here's a quote from Felicitas. She says, after they were mocking her for her moaning during childbirth, she said, now my sufferings are only mine, but when I face the beasts, there will be another who will live in me and will suffer for me, since I will be suffering for him. So these quotes, as well as the stories, become very popular as well, too, in our exchange. So much so, and again, who knows if that is 100% accurate to what she originally said. It doesn't matter, right? It's not as good a story. This becomes fodder for the conversion of Christians. People are so inspired by the strength of will and then the conviction of these folks who are who are clinging to their faith. Then we get this guy. From Christian historians, Decius is a bit of a four-letter word. So these early Christian historians that are writing about Decius make him out to be a really awful, awful, awful evil person. In reality, he was just kind of the old guard. So again, kind of inspired by some of the rules that Septimus Severus put into place, Decius just takes it further. And he is absolutely 100% convinced that the reason that things are going to pot is because we stopped following the old gods, right? So what Rome needs to do is it needs to go back to when Rome was great, follow the gods that they used to follow, and maybe the gods will look upon Rome with favor and turn around their fortunes, right? And again, if you read Roman history, 3rd century is where it begins to fall apart. By the end of the 3rd century is when it gets really interesting, the beginning of the 4th century. So what Decius does is he mandates that every single Roman citizen has to make sacrifice to the gods, right? And once they make sacrifice, they are given what's called a libellum, which is a certificate, which is proof of their sacrifice, okay? And so you can imagine what's happening is these soldiers are going around checking whether or not you've got your libellum, right? Whether you've made sacrifice on whichever day of the week. Well, guess what? Guess who doesn't do it? The Jews and the Christians. Again, right? It's the same old story. Decius is hardcore, though. And though his persecutions it's not quite so violent, he ends up rounding up and arresting way more people than we've seen prior to this. And mainly imprisoning them. He's not just outright executing Christians at this point, but he arrests a ton of people. And I mentioned this a little bit ago. One of the consequences of this is finally when Decius dies and a new guy takes over and he doesn't care as much about persecuting Christians, one of the things that the community has to struggle with is, well, who gave in, right? Who ended up getting their libellum? And if they did that, they were referred to as lapsed Christians, right? So they fell outside of orthodoxy at that point. They were out. They gave up. One of the other things that happens, though, on the other side of it, is that one of the labels that gets attributed to folks is the label confessor. And the confessors are those who, in the face of torture and imprisonment, refuse to recant, right? So they confess their faith. And so what you'll see is you will see Christians, carrying around this label, having it inscribed on their gravestones, or burial urns or whatever, is that so-and-so was a confessor of the faith, which is not just a random adjective, it's a title, right? To be a confessor was a big deal. You had in the same way, similar to they're a veteran, right? They've served, they've done their time. Contrast that with those who got a libellum. And one of the major conversations that happens, especially in the mid 3rd century and towards the end of the 3rd, is what do we do with the people that lapsed? And there's a lot of debate. There are hardliners who say they're out. They gave up on Christ, now Christ gives up on them. There are some moderates who say, well, they did mess up, but we're gonna make a process in which they can essentially get back into the good graces. And then there are, of course, on the other side are people who say, well, hey, they were being tortured. I don't know why we're making such a big stink out of this, right? You try getting tortured and see how you do under those circumstances. But the other thing that this does, though, is then, again, you get a real big emphasis now on orthodoxy, but not just in terms of theology, but orthodoxy in terms of, are you in the church, right? And there were actually, every church, I forget the name of it, but every church had a sign that it hung up basically at the front of their gathering space, which had a list of all of the different Christian communities that they were in contact with. And that list was up there because they prayed for them. But when a community fell out of sync with the rest of Christianity, they would erase the name off the list. And that was a big deal. Big deal, right? If you So this is what we're watching happen during the end of the 3rd century is, and you can kind of now see how this affects the arc of the church over the next millennium, right? Is, are you part of the institution? And again, we talk about this to contrast what the church looked like in prior centuries, right? So through the 2nd century especially, leadership was not, it wasn't coherent even. I mean, you had you had different models of leadership in each church. So some churches might have a bishop, some churches might have a group of elders called presbyters, some might have a papa, in the Latin-speaking churches, in other words, a pope. And women were involved in leadership. Over the course of the 3rd century, in reaction to a lot of different things, in reaction to the Montanists, in reaction to these different persecutions, you see a change happen within the church, which is now wanting to have a coherent and centralized leadership, wanting to establish a more concrete orthodoxy about what practices, and beliefs that they should have.
Okay, I may be a week or 2 ahead by what I'm saying, but when the time is right, could you speak about, and I'm just going to make a little quote.
Yeah, please.
The adoption of the Mother of Jesus as a virtual goddess may represent a reintroduction of aspects of the worship of Isis. To bring in the pagans,
Yeah.
the Marianized,
Yeah.
older goddess figures.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to make a note. Okay. And I'm going to promise to try to not erase this, which is I'm going to put. Anybody looks at this is going to be really confused, but I'm going to put Mary/ISIS. And it's lowercase ISIS, not capitals, to distinguish it from the Islamic State or the Islamic militant group, right? Okay. Fascinating, quick anecdote is there's a town in southern France that on the Mediterranean called Ez. Oh, how is that spelled? I think it's like this.
That's the name of ISIS.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a town. There might not be the E. There's a town in southern France called Ez, and it's named after the goddess Isis. There's a fascinating story about how that happens, but that's a much longer story than I have time to share this morning. But you can go there, and there's a chapel which the Ez is up on the top of the cliffs that overlook the Bay of Nice. It's really fascinating. There's this chapel all the way up at the top there, which has. It's trippy. Is all I can say about it. It's got this artwork that it pays homage to Egypt and stuff. Anyway, that's super cool.
That was on the History Channel.
Was it? Huh. Okay, so Paula, next week we'll talk about Mary and Isis. But yeah, that's a ways ahead yet. Because that's leading up to the cult of Mary. Which later develops, right? That's later in the story. Okay, that's what's happening to the church. Let's talk about what the church looked like. This is the part that I really find interesting. So Christian worship. We talked about this a little bit. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, again, what develops is worship is centered around what? Meal. 100%. In fact, we screwed this up. Us Protestants. For 1,500 years, meal has been the center of worship, okay? Catholic Mass has to have Eucharist. The two are synonymous, right? You get married, you have the Eucharist. You get buried, you have the Eucharist. It's changing a little bit, right? But meal has always been centered, okay? The origins of that are early Christian worship, okay? The Catholic, quote-unquote, Catholic Church doesn't just pull that out of nowhere. We screw it up in the 16th century when Luther placed the emphasis on preaching instead of the meal, and then suddenly you've got churches that are only communing once a month or even a couple of times a year, and you have to do all these things. We'll talk about that later. That stays consistent throughout the 3rd century. Again, though, the meal is restricted to those who have been baptized. Okay, you can participate in one half of the worship experience on Sunday mornings if you are a catechumenate or just curious. And what that looks like is they would gather, and we'll talk about where they gather in just a second, but they would gather and there would be readings. They would read from the aforementioned scriptures that were already in use. They would read from the stories of the martyrs. They would read from stories of the apostles, right? And it would take a long time. I mean, up to and maybe over 3 hours they would spend in reading and prayer. That's all they do. And praying was a big deal as well, right? So they had that list of other communities that they would pray for, right? Which, especially during a time of persecution, is really kind of interesting to think about. They're essentially praying for God to be with all these communities. Oh, we've heard that the church in Rome is undergoing, or such and such a church in Philippi is experiencing a rough time, so let's pray for them. That's the first half of the service. Yeah, we're only at the first half. So you'd start pretty early on Sunday morning. You'd do readings, you'd do prayer, and then at the midway point, everybody who wasn't baptized would be excused, and then they'd share the meal. And the meal really was a meal. So they would ceremonially share bread and wine. But then generally what happened is the whole community would bring food with them, and they would literally have lunch together on Sundays.
The original potluck.
The original potluck, absolutely. Absolutely. What's even more kind of impressive, I guess, about this is that this was also how they supported their community. So there was a president who presided over the community. And what they would do is they would then gather up these food donations, because not everything that was brought in was eaten then. And they would distribute those meals to the poor families and the widows in their community. So there's another thing that's going on during this time, which is caring for widows. Reason for this is kind of the old story that we know, which is that widows in Hebrew society, and then consequently later on in Roman society, generally were powerless, right? They didn't own property. So if their husband dies, they basically have to take refuge with family if they have family, right? So widows were one of these unprotected parts of the population that the Christian church really took care of. So they had a list of all the widows that were members of their community, and what the president was responsible for was making sure that these widows got fed on a weekly basis, right? Here's the fascinating thing that happens, is that this concept of widow becomes a bit of a metaphor as well, too. So what you end up having happen is that, again, ancient world, you were a widow until you could find a new husband, right? Especially, you got married at 16, your husband dies off in Britain, he gets shipped to the Isles and gets killed in battle. Get married as quick as you can so that you can, be back part of society again, whatever. What we watch happen in Christian communities is that some women choose not to get remarried. They continue to live life in the church, basically, and they're not, and it's not necessarily that they're, living off of the church, so to speak. They contribute to the community, but they choose specifically not to be remarried. And then what happens is we get people that are never married who become part of the church who are now called widows. What we're watching here is the development of female monasticism in the 3rd century. And female monasticism precedes male monasticism. Yes. So the idea of a monastic movement comes out of this, right? The Benedictine rule and all that crap comes out of the 400s, right? These are the early monastics. In other words, those who forsake, quote unquote, normal life to be part of the church. But again, monasticism in this model isn't about escaping away to the wilderness and living and, making wine somewhere or whatever you do. It's serving your community, right? Very fascinating. Very fascinating.
Not putting up with those jerks.
Not putting up with the jerks. Yeah. Yeah. We don't need them, guys. Yeah. So what else? So then they shared the meal. And the meal took a while as well, too, because then the meal continued with prayers additionally, right? So they would pray over the food. They would pray for different concerns. you would imagine too that during the meal was when they kind of dealt with the business of the church, additionally, right? When it was just the baptized now that were gathered there. But you can kind of now begin to see how worship develops over the timeline. You can see the seeds of what we have as the Catholic Mass later on. I mean, unfortunately, whatever, a lot of these words become ritualized, right? So prayer in these early worship gatherings were probably more spontaneous, right? They weren't rote in the way that we're used to in our liturgies, so to speak. But again, we can kind of begin to wonder or have curiosity about how that develops. How do some of these words become ritualized? We know for a fact that the baptismal creed, which we talked about earlier, which becomes the Apostles' Creed, was one of those ritualized pieces of language. The Lord's Prayer, additionally, becomes one of those ritualized pieces of language, right? And so it's, again, I just get a kick out of it thinking about how these are the seeds that we start with. I don't know if I'm pointing at the board, there's nothing up there, but metaphorically, these are the seeds that we start with. And then it's fascinating how we kind of build ritual around these seeds. One of the other pieces that I found absolutely interesting is the where, right? So where did people gather, okay? We know that homes were places that Christians gathered. And in fact, that was the preference when they could, right? Because homes have, shelter. And it's hard for your neighbors to spy on what you're doing, generally speaking. But one of the other places that Christians gathered were graveyards. Yeah, okay. Also known as, it starts with a C. Come on, Jesse. Cemetery, there's another word for it though. What's the creepy? Oh, we're close. We're so close. They're underground.
Oh, catacombs.
Catacombs. There we go. Thank you. Catacombs. So, it was illegal. Well, it wasn't illegal. It was not legal for Christians to be, for lack of a better word, to be a business, right? To be a functional institutional church, right? Again, it's most of the time not legal. So again, between these periods of persecution, generally what life looks like is nobody cares, right? They might be, they might get some flack from, hardcore true Roman neighbors or whatnot, but by and large, no one cares, right? You do what you do, I do, we're all fine. But one of the things that was true was that Christians could not create an institution and then own property, right? So in other words, a group of Christians could not create an institution, buy a building, and then put their mark in that building and say, this is the first church of Athens, right? Does that make sense? So what they did is they created funeral societies.
What kind of society?
Funeral societies. Because, keep in mind, the Roman Empire is broad. And you have different cultural and religious practice, but you also have different burial practices. So what the empire does essentially is it leaves burial, well, how you dispose of bodies, up to everybody, right? You do you. You do whatever makes sense. So for Christians who were incorporating Jewish burial practices, who literally would bury bodies, right? And again, this is, well, we're getting into medieval theology about, the intactness of the body so it could be resurrected. So the way that Christians got around not being able to own a building is they owned their cemeteries. They owned their catacombs where they buried their dead, right? And since they owned that property, that's where they'd often gather to worship. But there was another reason for it as well, because they believed that when they shared the meal, they shared it with the deceased, right? So they would literally have their meal in the catacombs. So they would share the Eucharist surrounded by the martyrs or, those who had gone before. Totally fascinating. And really for me is interesting considering, our All Saints Sunday practices. But yeah, so they would gather in categories. Here's the other thing, it's that in some ways it backfired too, because some of the rumors that were spread around were they were eating the flesh of their dead. You can see where this comes from. They were, again, met with suspicion, because who hangs out in graveyards? Weirdos and goths, that's who, right? And vampires, right? People who dye their hair black and, wear long, I'm making jokes about modern teenagers. Or well, I should say teenagers when I grew up, they listened to The Cure and Susie and the Banshees and stuff like that.
So that probably explains why on the Day of the Dead that they bring food and put it on the altar of their ancestry.
Yeah, the Dia de los Muertos practices, if they don't come out of that, they're definitely recreating that in a sense. Yeah. Sharing a meal with the dead. What an interesting concept. Oh.
Related any to ancestor worship?
That's a bit, this is one of those Venn diagram moments where, ancestor worship is a different thing, right? And ancestor worship actually in a lot of ways predates traditional religiosity, right? Predates monotheism, right? Human beings have been worshiping ancestors for a long time, right? There are similarities between ancestor worship and, Christian practices, right? In fact, you could argue that the veneration of saints is effectively ancestor worship, but I don't think they're necessarily influencing each other. They're, it's like ancestor worship, Christianity, there's some common ground in the middle of it. Definitely, here's the one thing I would say is that, Christianity practices syncretism over history as well too, right? Especially during the beginning of the second millennium when we're sending missionaries by boat, right, to the far-flung parts of dark Africa and the New World, and converting the barbarian, whatever derogatory term you want to use for the native peoples of any given land or place. One of the things that we do is we also let people incorporate their native of religiosity in with Christianity, which is where Dia de los Muertos comes out of, where shockingly a lot of what we consider to be standardized modern religious practice comes out of as well. The dates for Easter and Christmas are basically the subversion of existing festivals that existed in Rome, right? That's
The Christmas tree.
well, yeah, the Yule log that we sat upright and decided not to burn. Different story. I've got a couple minutes, and then we better get to worship, which is the teaser for what we're going to talk about next week. This pretty much gets us through the 3rd century. I know, we cruised through it really quickly. 100 years in about 45 minutes. I'm impressed with myself. The end of the 3rd century, the beginning of the 4th, is where it proverbially hits the fan. Okay? And the beginning of the 4th century is what is often referred to as the Great Persecution. And we have all to blame 2 guys, a guy named Diocletian and a guy named Galerius. And it's one of those stories where it has to get worse before it gets better. Moving into the end of the 4th century, what we see in the Roman Empire is the same stuff we saw in the middle of the 3rd century, the beginning of the 3rd century, which is it's getting bad, okay? Rome has spread its arms far and wide and has swallowed up a large part of that world, and now that world is biting back, right? So they're having a hard time maintaining the territories that they've conquered. They're fighting wars on multiple fronts and suffering defeats for the first time in a while. Things are getting rough. Guess what happens? The same thing that happened with Septimus Severus and Decius and all the emperors before them that advocated that the way that we do better is we return to the way things used to be. Well, this guy, for whatever reason, absolutely hates Christians and legitimate, we're not just slandering a guy because he can't speak for himself. This guy despises Christianity. He sees them as weak, right? Because one of the things that happens at the end of the 3rd century, for whatever reason, we don't really know the full history of it, is there's a revolt, a military revolt. It happens in North Africa or something like this. something happens which results in the army executing every single Christian member of the army, okay? Which Galerius hears about, right? Which is bad. If an army has to execute its own, that's awful. Things are going really poorly if they're executing their own members. It's bad for morale. It's bad for the populace to see. It does not inspire confidence from the broader populace of Rome. Galerius sees this and he gets an idea, which essentially is the idea: we need to wipe out Christianity. Okay, that's where we'll leave it off today. That's my teaser for next week. But this essentially, and I'll talk about the Diocletian. This is where Constantine comes out, by the way. Constantine is the son of a very important person who happens to be also a general that's stationed up in modern-day Germany during this time, and he comes in and ends up going head-to-head with Galerius, and that's where this all comes out. So, all right, thanks, folks. We'll see you in worship. Which is going to be yet more history, by the way. Yes.